Idi Amin promised stability and change for Uganda. But within months, his rule turned into one of the most violent dictatorships in modern African history. Soldiers, political opponents, religious leaders, and ordinary civilians began disappearing. Many of them executed without trial and dumped into rivers or mass graves. The scars of this brutality still haunt the nation today. When Idi Amin seized power on January 25, 1971, he understood that if he wanted to stay in control, he had to eliminate anyone inside the army who might challenge him. Within days of the coup, he began quietly removing soldiers. At first, it looked like routine military reshuffling. Some officers were transferred. Some were called in for questioning. But by February 1971, the arrests were becoming much more obvious. Soldiers suspected of being loyal to Obote were detained by military police and taken away for interrogation. Many were transported to one of the most feared places in the country, the military prison inside Makinji Military Barracks. Makinji Barracks had existed long before Amin's rule, but under him, it turned into a center of torture and execution. Former prisoners who survived later described the environment inside the barracks in horrifying detail. Prisoners were often locked inside cramped cells that were already packed with detainees. Guards would pull individuals out for interrogation at any time of the day or night. Once taken from the cell, many prisoners never returned. The methods used there were brutal and direct. Soldiers were beaten with rifle butts, metal rods, and wooden clubs. Some prisoners had their limbs broken during interrogations. Others were tied up and shot at close range inside small execution rooms. Survivors later described walls stained with blood and corridors where bodies were left lying on the floor for hours before being removed. The guards rarely tried to hide what they were doing. Fear was the entire point. Amin's forces also began targeting entire groups of soldiers at once. Military units suspected of loyalty to Obote were sometimes surrounded, disarmed, and arrested in large numbers. Truckloads of detainees would be taken away from the barracks late at night. Neighbors living near the compounds often heard the engines of military trucks leaving after midnight. Those trucks were full of prisoners. By morning, the vehicles would return empty. The families of those soldiers rarely received any explanation. Many wives went from police station to police station trying to find out where their husbands had gone. Most were simply told that no such prisoner existed. It became common for entire households to disappear from army neighborhoods overnight. Children woke up the next morning with their fathers gone and no idea why. By the end of 1971, thousands of people connected in some way to Milton Obote's government had vanished. After securing control of the army, Idi Amin moved on to the next step of consolidating his power. He wanted to make sure that anyone in the country who even thought about opposing him would be discovered quickly and eliminated before they could organize resistance. To do that, he began building a network of intelligence agencies and security forces that answered directly to him. One of the most feared organizations created during this time was the State Research Bureau. On paper, it looked like a normal intelligence service responsible for gathering national security information. In reality, it quickly became one of the most brutal secret police organizations in Africa during the 1970s. The Bureau reported directly to Amin, which meant its officers operated with almost no legal limits. The headquarters of the State Research Bureau were located in the Nakasero district of Kampala, inside a large government building in Nakasero. From the outside, it looked like a normal administrative office, but inside, it functioned as a secret prison and interrogation center. People arrested by the Bureau were often brought directly into the basement of the building, where interrogations took place. Survivors who later escaped or were released described the conditions there as terrifying. Prisoners were blindfolded and taken into small rooms where interrogators demanded information about political activity, suspected opposition groups, or criticism of Amin's government. The torture methods used inside the building were extremely violent. Electric shocks were applied to prisoners' bodies using wires connected to generators. Some detainees were beaten repeatedly with metal rods or cables until they lost consciousness. Others were suffocated using plastic bags or water poured over cloth covering their faces. Many prisoners never left the building alive. What made the State Research Bureau especially frightening was its ability to operate quickly. Its agents did not always wear uniforms. They often drove unmarked vehicles and carried out arrests in the middle of the night. A person could be taken from their home, workplace, or even from the street in broad daylight. Neighbors might see men pushing someone into a car, but few dared to intervene because everyone knew which organization was responsible. Alongside the State Research Bureau, Amin also created another security force, known as the Public Safety Unit. While the Bureau focused more on intelligence gathering and interrogation, the Public Safety Unit acted like a mobile enforcement squad. Its members were heavily armed and often deployed during raids against suspected enemies of the regime. The Public Safety Unit quickly gained a reputation for extreme violence. When they were sent to arrest someone accused of opposing Amin, the operation often ended with the target being killed on the spot rather than taken into custody. Entire neighborhoods sometimes watched as armed officers dragged people from houses and executed them nearby. By 1973, the atmosphere in Uganda had changed completely. Fear had spread through every level of society. Teachers worried about what they said in classrooms. Journalists avoided writing anything critical of the government. Civil servants avoided discussing politics, even with close colleagues. Soldiers themselves lived with constant anxiety because purges inside the military continued whenever Amin suspected disloyalty. Among the many methods used by Amin's regime to eliminate enemies, one of the most direct and visible was execution by firing squad. This method had been used by armies around the world for centuries, but under Amin, it became a tool of intimidation designed to send a clear message to the population. These executions were usually carried out by soldiers using automatic rifles, such as AK-47s. Prisoners were brought to open areas inside military compounds or sometimes to empty fields outside towns. Their hands were often tied behind their backs, and they were forced either to kneel or stand in a line facing the soldiers assigned to carry out the shooting. One of the most common locations where these executions took place was the same prison complex where many detainees were held, Makinji Military Barracks. Inside the compound, certain areas were used specifically for executions. Guards would bring prisoners from their cells, often without telling them what was about to happen. And within minutes, soldiers would form a firing line and open fire. These shootings were not always hidden from the public. In some cases, executions were deliberately carried out where local residents or other soldiers could witness them. Amin believed fear was one of the most powerful ways to maintain control. When people saw what happened to those accused of opposing the government, they were far less likely to challenge authority themselves. Victims of these executions included a wide range of people. Some were soldiers accused of plotting coups against Amin. Others were government officials suspected of corruption or disloyalty. Civilians could also become targets if they were accused of helping opposition groups or spreading criticism of the regime. One particularly noticeable incident occurred in 1972 when a group of soldiers was accused of planning a conspiracy to overthrow Amin. Dozens of them were arrested and brought together for punishment. Instead of secret executions, the government decided to carry out the killings publicly to send a message throughout the army. The prisoners were lined up and shot by fellow soldiers. This tactic forced members of the military to participate directly in the regime's violence, which created another layer of control. In some situations, the regime also recorded executions. Film footage showing prisoners being shot was occasionally used as propaganda inside the country. But these public executions represented only one side of the regime's violence. While firing squads were meant to be seen, many other killings were carried out secretly, where bodies were dumped into rivers. Uganda is crossed by the powerful Nile River, which begins at Lake Victoria and flows north through the country before continuing towards Sudan and Egypt. It is one of the longest rivers in the world, stretching more than 6,600 kilometers. During Amin's rule in the 1970s, this river turned into a silent dumping ground for thousands of victims. The process was frighteningly simple. Prisoners who had already been executed or beaten to death inside military prisons were loaded onto trucks during the night. These trucks usually came from detention centers or from interrogation sites run by Amin's security agencies. Soldiers drove the vehicles to remote bridges or riverbanks where there were few witnesses. In the darkness, bodies were dragged out and thrown directly into the floating water. This was done for a very clear reason. Dumping bodies in the river helped hide evidence. The current carried the corpses far away from the places where the killings happened, and animals in the water quickly destroyed what remained. But even with that plan, the scale of the killings became impossible to hide. Fishermen who worked along the Nile were among the first to see what was happening. Many later reported that they regularly saw bodies drifting in the water. Some were naked, others still wore military uniforms or civilian clothes. In several cases, the victims had their hands tied behind their backs, showing they had been prisoners before they died. Fishermen sometimes tried to push the bodies away from their nets because the remains were interfering with their work. The situation became so severe that workers at nearby hospitals and infrastructure sites began noticing the consequences. Engineers responsible for maintaining the large hydroelectric facility at Owen Falls Dam started reporting a horrifying problem. The machinery that drew water into the turbines occasionally became clogged by decomposing bodies carried down the river. When this happened, maintenance crews had to shut down parts of the system and physically remove the remains. Medical staff in the region also encountered the realities of these killings. Doctors near Lake Victoria sometimes received bodies recovered from the water. Many were badly decomposed, but some still showed clear injuries, such as gunshot wounds or broken bones. These discoveries confirmed what many Ugandans had already begun to suspect. Human rights investigators who later studied Amin's rule estimated that thousands of victims ended up in the Nile during the 1970s. The exact number will probably never be known because many bodies were never recovered at all. Families searching for missing relatives often suspected the worst, but had no proof. As the decade continued, the violence began to take on a very clear pattern. The regime increasingly targeted specific ethnic groups that Amin believed might threaten his power. Uganda is home to many ethnic communities, and political alliances often follow those lines. Because the former president, Milton Obote, had drawn strong support from northern groups, Amin became deeply suspicious of anyone connected to those communities. Two of the groups most heavily targeted were the Acholi and the Langi. These communities had provided a large number of soldiers to the Ugandan army during Obote's time in power. When Amin overthrew Obote in 1971, many Acholi and Langi soldiers were still serving in the military. Amin quickly began viewing them as potential enemies who might try to overthrow him in return. The result was a series of brutal purges inside the armed forces. Soldiers from these groups were arrested in large numbers. Some were taken from their barracks during inspections. Others were summoned to meetings with commanders and then detained on the spot. Once arrested, many were transported to prisons or military compounds, where they were interrogated and later executed. By the mid-1970s, the behavior of Idi Amin had grown increasingly unpredictable. His government had already eliminated thousands of soldiers and civilians, but the atmosphere of fear was not calming the country. Instead, resistance to his rule was slowly growing both inside Uganda and abroad. Amin began to suspect that powerful institutions, including churches, might be quietly supporting opposition movements. Religion played a major role in Ugandan society. Churches were respected places where people gathered regularly, and many religious leaders held strong influence within their communities. Amin started viewing that influence as a potential threat. One of the most important religious figures in Uganda at the time was Janani Luwum. Luwum served as the Archbishop of the Anglican Church in Uganda and was widely respected across the country. Unlike many political figures, he was not involved in government power struggles, but he became increasingly concerned about the violence taking place under Amin's rule. As reports of disappearances and killings spread during the mid-1970s, Luwum and other church leaders began raising concerns about human rights abuses. They delivered petitions and statements criticizing the government's actions and asking for investigations into the growing number of deaths. This placed Luwum directly in the path of the regime. In February 1977, security forces arrested him along with several senior government ministers who were also suspected of opposing Amin. The arrests shocked many Ugandans because Luwum was a religious leader rather than a political rival. His detention showed that even respected figures in the church were no longer protected. Shortly after the arrest, the government released an official announcement claiming that Luwum had died in a car accident while being transported by security officers. According to the story presented by the authorities, the vehicle had crashed and killed him. But this explanation quickly began to fall apart. Later investigations revealed evidence that Luwum had actually been executed. His body showed signs of gunshot wounds rather than injuries consistent with a traffic accident. Witness accounts and later reports indicated that he had likely been shot by government forces after his arrest. The killing of Janani Luwum sent shockwaves far beyond Uganda. Churches and governments around the world condemned the incident and demanded answers. It became one of the most widely reported atrocities of Amin's rule and drew serious international attention to the human rights abuses happening in the country. Inside Uganda, however, the reaction was very different. Ordinary citizens already living under intense fear understood the message clearly. If a man as respected as the Archbishop could be arrested and killed, then absolutely no one was beyond the reach of the regime. Even members of Amin's own government were not safe. Ministers who fell out of favor sometimes disappeared just like ordinary citizens. One well-known example involved Foreign Minister Michael Ondonga and several colleagues who were arrested and later found dead under suspicious circumstances. By the late 1970s, the rule of Idi Amin was beginning to crumble, even though the violence inside Uganda had not stopped. The country had become increasingly isolated from much of the world. Many foreign governments had already cut diplomatic ties, and Uganda's economy was collapsing. One of the biggest reasons for this economic disaster was Amin's decision in August 1972 to expel tens of thousands of Asians from the country. Most of these families had originally come from India and Pakistan during the colonial era and had built many of Uganda's businesses, factories, and shops. When Amin suddenly forced around 60,000 Asians to leave within 90 days, their properties and companies were handed to Amin's supporters, many of whom had little experience running them. Within a few years, factories stopped producing goods, shops closed, and the national economy began falling apart. At the same time, political opponents of Amin were escaping the country whenever they could. Many former soldiers, politicians, and activists fled across Uganda's borders and began organizing resistance movements. One of the main places they gathered was the neighboring country of Tanzania. Tanzania was led by President Julius Nyerere, who had never trusted Amin and had openly criticized his government. Nyerere also had a personal reason to oppose Amin, because he had been a close ally of Uganda's former leader Milton Obote. When Obote was overthrown in 1971, he himself fled to Tanzania, where Nyerere allowed him to live in exile. For several years, groups of Ugandan exiles trained in camps inside Tanzania, hoping one day they could return and remove Amin from power. But the situation finally exploded into open war in 1978, when Amin made a serious mistake that changed everything. In October of that year, Ugandan troops crossed the border and invaded the Kagera region of northern Tanzania. Amin claimed that the territory belonged to Uganda, but most observers believed the invasion was an attempt to distract the Ugandan population from the country's worsening economic problems. President Julius Nyerere responded immediately. Instead of treating the border attack as a small incident, he ordered a full military counteroffensive. Tanzanian forces began mobilizing thousands of troops and advanced toward the Ugandan border. At the same time, the Tanzanian government officially joined forces with Ugandan exile groups who wanted to overthrow Amin. These combined forces formed what became known as the Uganda-Tanzania War. The war quickly turned against Amin. His army had once been huge, but years of purges, executions, and internal distrust had badly weakened it. By early 1979, the coalition forces had pushed north and were steadily advancing toward the capital city of Kampala. Town after town fell with little resistance. In many places, Ugandan civilians welcomed the advancing troops because they believed the nightmare of Amin's rule might finally be ending. On April 11, 1979, Tanzanian forces entered Kampala and captured the city after heavy fighting. Idi Amin had already fled before the capital fell. His first destination was Libya, where the country's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, welcomed him. However, Libya was only a temporary stop. Soon afterwards, Amin moved again, this time to Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government agreed to give him asylum, on the condition that he stay out of politics and live quietly. Amin accepted those terms, and eventually settled in the coastal city of Jeddah. In July 2003, his health began to fail. He suffered kidney failure and was admitted to a hospital in Jeddah. His condition continued to worsen in the following weeks, and on August 16, 2003, he died at the age of 78. For many people in Uganda, his death brought mixed emotions. Some felt relief that the man responsible for so much suffering was finally gone. Others felt frustration that he had never been forced to answer for his actions in court. The man who had overseen one of the most brutal regimes in modern African history died quietly in a hospital bed, far away from the country he once ruled.